Good evening. We begin tonight with a slowdown on our highways today as a truck convoy traveling to Ottawa made its way through our area, while security forces on Parliament Hill said they're preparing for up to 10,000 protesters this weekend. We estimate around 2,000 people were seen when the convoy traveled through Niagara and Hamilton.
The protest began as a pushback against vaccination mandates for truck drivers, but now appears to have expanded into other areas. Kelly Botello reports.
A convoy of truckers arrived in Hamilton this morning to crowds of supporters lining Centennial Parkway and neighboring streets. Organizers have called it the Freedom Convoy.
I'm here to support freedom and the freedom to choose.
Because I believe we have to protect our rights as citizens. This isn't about a vaccine or no vaccine. It's about what we're able to do every day.
The movement started out as a way to protest Canada's new rule that unvaccinated truckers can't cross the border without quarantining. The supporters here today say truckers have been doing essential work this entire pandemic and shouldn't be penalized now for not wanting the vaccine.
These guys are sitting in their trucks bringing us food. They've been doing it the whole time, and they're trying to stop them now, or at least stop a small percentage of them.
The government says nearly 90% of Canadian truckers are already vaccinated, but supporters here today say this movement has grown into something more.
I feel like at the start of the pandemic, the government shut down and said the vaccines were our way out of here. We're over 80% vaccinated in this province. I think over 90. You know, we're gonna have to get boosters.
It's our body, our choice. It shouldn't be forced upon anyone, right? It's not an all or nothing package deal.
With all these mandates to work, we can't go freely to shop, to eat. It's ridiculous.
Before stopping in Hamilton, the convoy made its way through Fort Erie, where a smaller crowd of supporters cheered them on. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has called the truck convoy that's making its way to Ottawa a small fringe minority of people who hold unacceptable views. The Canadian Trucking Alliance also releasing a statement against these protests.
Creating the divide between two different types of people when we've always been together as one, and now it's just complete separation, and it's devastating.
The truck demonstration in Ottawa is planned for Saturday. Kelly Botello, CHCH News.
Good evening. Welcome to the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. This episode tonight is dedicated to the worldwide resistance that is rising around the world in countries. You've seen there the footage from Canada of the Canadian Freedom Convoy, which consists up to 50,000 trucks arriving in Ottawa this Saturday, tomorrow, for a freedom rally in Canada against vaccine mandates and vaccine passports. Now, you may or may not have heard of this convoy on the basis that the mainstream media up until recently were largely silent, despite the fact that this convoy now extends 40 miles in its length, end to end, these trucks traveling towards Ottawa, having left British Columbia last weekend as protests took place in over 150 cities in 40 plus countries around the world simultaneously last weekend. Now, the vaccine mandate protests in London, if you watch the Pandemic Podcast footage, was very successful, with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people protesting peacefully for the NHS staff and care workers as part of the Flatten the Mandates campaign. Now, while some of these protests were indeed covered by the mainstream media, often with the usual smearing, but given the scale of the resistance and around the world and the speed at which the dominant narrative is beginning to crumble, why are the mainstream media and the public, indeed the wider public, not paying wider attention? So in tonight's episode, we're going to take a closer look at the global resistance here, because it's really important for us here in the UK and for those of you watching from different parts of the world to understand that this isn't an isolated incident. The protests that we saw in London and the truckers in Canada, these aren't isolated protests. There is resistance rising all around the world. Last weekend, as I mentioned, we saw 150 cities participating simultaneously over the weekend in 40 different countries. So let's talk a little bit about the convoy in Canada. This largely went unspoken about in the media until Joe Rogan and Russell Brand and other influencers started talking about this convoy. We heard about it early on in the Pandemic podcast. We had word from the organizers in Canada this was going to happen. Unfortunately, we weren't able to break the news early on, but we're here talking about it here today. And isn't it hilarious how Joe Rogan has become one of the main sources of news? Now, we've been trying hard for the last 2 years on the Pandemic podcast to make our mark, getting the word out there. We haven't got the same baseline audience that Joe Rogan has got. But Joe, we're chasing your tails, my friend, from across the pond, our brother in truth, trying to raise awareness of the issues around the world. But once Joe Rogan had covered this convoy, all of a sudden the mainstream media, in order to not lose their viewership, started covering perhaps this issue. Now, in Canada, in the latest series of mandatory requirements set by the federal government, is actually causing food shortages. You know, we've talked about this on the podcast before about the kind of doomsday scenarios, but in Canada, due to the mandates, there are genuine food shortages and a hike in pricing of the food because of the shortages, the scarcity. The Premier of Alberta tweeted over the weekend saying that the quarantine requirements for unvaccinated truck drivers is making a bad situation worse. So this is occurring because of the vaccine mandates, where if you're unvaccinated, you're unable to travel and deliver food. And as a result, the food prices are skyrocketing in Canada, the supply shortages. This is far removed from Common Sense Corner here on the Pandemic podcast. So we can see again in different parts of the world that policy issues are driving real issues for citizens. So this is purely a government decision in Canada that has caused these huge food shortages and price increases at a time where, you know, people have been struggling anyway due to the economic issues that have been rippling around the world. And again, Canada has put in border crossing regulations preventing American truck drivers who are not fully vaccinated entering into Canada. So in many ways, Canada is causing a problem of its own creation with these mandates. And yet Justin Trudeau seems to be responding. The harder he pushes, the harder he doubles down on this situation. So the data from the American Trucking Association shows that perhaps only 50 to 60% of the US truckers are fully vaccinated, which means that thousands of drivers are ineligible for the cross-border shipments due to this Canadian mandate. So the truck convoy, as I said, up to 50,000 trucks at any one time, 40-mile stretch, making their way to Ottawa for a huge demonstration this weekend tomorrow. They're hoping there to greet Trudeau with a strong message. This freedom convoy to tackle these mandates, and this has happened at great support. You saw in the video there at the beginning that the public are coming out in numbers to support these truckers who are taking a stand. The truckers themselves have raised over 7 million Canadian dollars. That's £4 million from the public, showing just the scale of the public support to support this initiative. Now, you heard in the news report that Trudeau is calling these as fringe views that are not tolerated in the Canadian country. You don't raise over 7 million Canadian dollars if these are just fringe views. I mean, if any of you tried running a crowdfunder before, it takes some effort to get public appeal. So not quite so fringe, Mr. Trudeau, I would say. So that's Canada. Now let's take a look at what's happening in other parts of the world. As I mentioned, 150 cities last weekend. You know, the public, I think, the mainstream public, for those of you who are watching the Pandemic podcast, you know that these protests are happening, certainly in the nations that you're residing in. I'm very sure you're active in attending these protests yourself. But for the majority of people who are kind of getting back to their lives, perhaps aren't aware at the scale at which these protests are occurring, not only in terms of the sheer number of locations around the world that these are happening in simultaneous effect, but also how many parts of the COVID narrative that we've been talking about here for nearly 2 years, over 400 episodes covering the issues, are starting to come to light through the mainstream media, the medical journals, and wider afield. The narrative is beginning to crumble as the resistance rises. So Now, with the Omicron strain beginning to dominate, case numbers have been high in different places, but hospitalizations have generally been lower than they were previously. Yet vaccine mandates and vaccine passports for many parts of the population are still being pushed, and pushed hard, by the authorities in different parts of the world. But as this has happened, the resistance has been growing equally strongly in the previous months as mandates have been enforced. Many of those, fortunately, who have been vaccinated are joining the resistance as a matter of choice for people's freedoms, to stand up for people's right to choose against these discriminatory and authoritarian mandates. So people are no longer protesting purely about the vaccines and the issues that pertain to the vaccines, but more broadly about the mandates themselves and the right to bodily autonomy and informed consent and the ability for restriction-free travel. So let's have a look at what's been happening around the world last weekend. Let's have a look at some of the wider initiatives that are taking part around the world, the protests, the rallies, the campaign. Are they beginning to bear fruit? Let's ask ourselves these questions in tonight's episode. Now, please, I encourage you to hit the share button tonight, because just moments before I was about to go live, I found out from Facebook that I'm currently suspended from broadcasting on Facebook for the next 7 days. So this is going live to YouTube and Twitter only at this moment in time. We've added it to our brand new Elevate Network platform, which will be is in beta testing at the minute. We've got a number of people there testing our platform. So hello, if you're watching live on the Elevate Network platform, that's going to be open to the public next week. But the large majority of our audience are currently normally active on Facebook, and we've just had that right removed for simply sharing a first-hand account from an NHS doctor about the mandate. So as a result of sharing that first-hand account from the doctors, we are having our content suppressed, which is one of the many reasons why people are protesting around the world. We've seen this lack of debate, we've seen a lack of freedom of expression, and of course the mandates themselves in their authoritarian nature are causing great divide and challenges for many populations around the world. So hit the share button, please, wherever you're watching this. Please take the YouTube link, share it on Telegram, share it on Facebook. Help us to get this message out, because it's really, really important that we enable the public to see that there is a real pushback here. There is a real resistance. But not only that, we've suffered from an almost crisis of legitimacy on the basis that the mainstream media haven't covered the broad issues and the deep issues that have emerged over the last couple of years. But that narrative is now beginning to crumble. It is beginning to fall. Day by day, the pieces of evidence are coming to the forefront. Many of those things that we've been talking about for nearly 2 years here on the podcast. So let's help people find out that they're not alone in feeling uncomfortable about the way things have run for the last 2 years and the way things continue to run with the vaccine mandates and the vaccine passports. So hit the share button. We're going to cover now the different, the whole different range of protest activity and resistance that's occurring around the world in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, South America, New Zealand, as I mentioned, in 150 cities over the last weekend in 40 different countries. This level of coordination around the world, by the way, is a real show of solidarity of the people against these vaccine mandates and more broadly the overreach of governments. My personal view here is, with one or two big pushes, this is how we're talking in the United Kingdom at least, with one, specifically England, because things are, for those of you who are in the United Kingdom and Ireland, the devolved nations are all doing different things. But in England, we are pushing hard on the NHS vaccine mandates. And we believe with one big push, one solid united push, in addition to the legal cases that are now emerging, there's two major legal cases that have come to bear in the last couple of days. We believe that we can overcome these mandates. And it's also my firm belief that as we continue to coordinate nationally, the sooner we coordinate even more internationally, I do believe with some strong big pushes, we can see the back of vaccine mandates and vaccine passports and start moving forward and move into a new free world that is open for our creation. So regardless of political affiliation, your creed, your background, people all over the world are beginning to see the need for a coordinated response that I've just described on a global level and a national level to take action against the global overreach of governments and central authorities in not only creating mandates, but also creating these wide sweeping impact this wide-sweeping intervention on our civil liberties and our human rights. Now, in the European Union, we've seen the vaccine passports implemented in places like Austria, Germany, France, Italy, Greece, and even more damning and concerning has been in Austria and places like Greece, fines for the unvaccinated population, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's interesting to note that and observe that Spain and Portugal, even though they've had these exceptionally high, they've got exceptionally high vaccine uptakes, but they've decided not to implement vaccine mandates. And so far, they only have the border requirements in place, which we hope, as I say, with a big push, we'll see them fall. So let's take a look at some of the countries where the pushback seemed to be working. We've talked about Canada. Let's talk about Austria. Austria hit the news when they talked about, they were one of the first countries to introduce this idea of an unvaccinated lockdown. Now, it ended up being a full a full lockdown. It was the first country to impose an all-encompassing vaccine mandate off the back of that across its adult population. So they were pushing for this all-encompassing vaccine mandate, which is set to take effect from 14 years old upwards, a nationwide vaccine mandate to come into effect from next month in February, which is going to be accompanied by fines of up to 3,600 euros per quarter every 90 days. So they went from having this unvaccinated lockdown idea to a full lockdown, followed by a full nationwide vaccine mandate. To that end, we've made sad. There's memes on the internet about this. There's people almost joking about this situation. The scene from the film where they said, you're hiding unvaccinated people under the floorboards. Well, that sounds extreme, but to that end, in Austria, they've reportedly begun hiring headhunters to track down those people who remain unvaccinated. This is to me is an example of what I call vaccine extremism. Not only the fines of 3,600 euros, that's a significant amount of money every 90 days, but also headhunters to track people down. Now, of course, this episode is about the resistance. The mandate has resulted in frequent large-scale protests against the mandate, as well as an entire political movement opposing this policy. An open letter recently sent to the Austria's interior minister, signed by 600 police officers, also expressing opposition to mandatory vaccination. Now, this is an important point to recognize, again, in the global pushback against these types of mandates, is we are seeing public servants standing up. The healthcare workers, police, military, all forms of public sector workers stepping up to say no to their own government, which is really, really important to see that. And again, this movement is many times suffered a crisis of legitimacy due to the way that the media portray those involved. But quite clearly, when law enforcement stand up and the military stand up, it shows a real strength. Now, it does appear that these opposition in Austria are beginning to have an effect. Now, earlier last week, it was announced that the vaccine mandate law cannot be enforced until at least April due to technical complications, right? So it's at least been delayed. Now, delays obviously are not the most favorable outcome, but it buys time, and particularly in that type of scenario in Austria, where they're talking about vaccinating every citizen over the age of 14. My goodness, that's a big battle to take on. Now, similarly, in Germany, we've seen much pushback and delay. In December last year, the German Ethics Council gave the stamp of approval for vaccine mandates. It currently has a proof of vaccination requirement for entry into public spaces. It's got limited gatherings for up to 10 people. Large events like football matches have been held without an audience as part of those restrictions. But again, many of these particular restrictions target the unvaccinated, with proof of vaccination or recovery required to enter non-essential stores, amongst other things. Now, of course, again, with these widespread mandates, we've seen huge uprisings in Germany. Weekly Monday protests in Berlin and other cities have drawn upwards of 70,000 protests at a time on the streets. And it's very apparent that this resistance is starting to make a difference, because what's come to bear in like in Austria, also due to technicalities, the vaccine mandates can't be enforced until at least June. So again, we've seen this this pushback, delay, and of course, it really questions the feasibility and the question of these mandates being risen full stop. So are we now beginning to see the cracks unfold in some of the hardest hit countries like Austria and Germany? Maybe we are. This is all good news. Now, we're also seeing the signs of rebellion in the Netherlands. Again, many of these countries have been imposing very strict restrictions throughout the pandemic. The strict lockdowns that have been in effect since mid-December have been peacefully and deliberately challenged in the Netherlands, or the Dutch government having to concede to reducing the remit of the lockdowns considerably in the face of these protests, demonstrating once again that strong resistance can achieve results. The Unheard publication, which you may be familiar with in the UK, said that the bars and restaurants in Amsterdam and other parts of the Netherlands have been opening regardless of the restrictions, again showing the pushback from the business sector, who are opening up despite the mandates and restrictions, pushing back in their own unique way, especially around the borders and near Germany and Belgium. And many of the restaurants and hospitality venues opening their doors in the face, including galleries and museums, hairdressers, gyms, etc., to major corporations opening their doors despite the mandates. So here we are in the United Kingdom with no such lockdown or any other measures. Wales has been slightly harder, in Scotland and other parts of the UK, but certainly there in the Netherlands, they've seen a much stricter lockdown again. But the pushback is beginning to succeed, both at a citizen level and at a business level. Now, have the Dutch been instigating? Has this citizens' disobedience made an effect? Well, let's see. Let's see what impact it has. Now, in the meantime, the government in the Netherlands is expected to announce that it will allow certain parts of society. It may have even begun to happen now this week. This was off the back of a news conference earlier this week. I think things are changing in Netherlands already, and again showing the resistance is working. Now, what about what about other parts of Europe? Let's talk about France. France is a unique case on the basis that it has a history of what the media calls vaccine hesitancy. But President Macron recently vowed to piss off the unvaccinated people by making their lives so complicated that they would end up getting jabbed. Now, let's enter into common sense corner for a minute. If you were a loving, kind, compassionate, caring president or prime minister of a nation, and you were really wanting people to get vaccinated on the basis that you felt that it would save their life or protect them from ill health, wouldn't you be much more kind and compassionate and loving in your approach and say, I really care about you, and it's really important you do this in order to protect your health? You would expect that to be the case if you were really truly doing this for care and compassion and for healthcare reasons. But no, Mr. Macron, he's going to piss off the unvaccinated by making their lives hell. Really sounds like a caring, compassionate approach. He added that the unvaccinated people were irresponsible, being unworthy of being considered citizens. This, to me, is a classic example of vaccine extremism. Many examples of this can be found around the world, where political leaders have entered in this extremist views, and in my view, should be treated as extremists and as any other form of political extremist or otherwise. In many ways, you could describe it as potential forms of terrorism if it goes on to impact the lives of their citizens. If you follow through with a threat like that to make lives complicated and no longer consider your citizens as citizens, I mean, that's a dangerous path. But of course, subsequently, good old France, when it comes to vaccine mandates, we've seen pushback before. And again, there's record numbers of crowds in Paris and other parts of France, hundred thousands of people protesting. with a strong message back to President Macron saying, well, we'll be the ones pissing you off, actually. So strong pushback. We've seen people protesting outside of the venues that are insisting on vaccination. We've seen people eating on the streets, on the streets of Paris, refusing to go into restaurants. We salute the people of France for their stand for liberty and hope that they do indeed manage to piss off the authorities who are driving segregation and discrimination. So now let's take a moment to look at, to breathe for a second, slow down, because I'm being like a freight train here, just like the convoy, not quite making its speed like a freight train, but making strong progress. So let's take a time to now turn our attention to other parts of the border. We've looked at Canada, we've looked at parts of Europe. What about the United States? Well, on Sunday, you may have seen that there was a huge rally in Washington, D.C. against the vaccine mandates called they call Washington the Heart of Freedom. Many thousands of people attending, speeches from Robert Kennedy, Dr. Robert Malone, Dr. Peter McCullough, Kat Lindley, Del Bigtree, JP Sears, Tess Laurie from our own shores here in the UK. Many people from faith backgrounds, public sector, firefighters, doctors, there to take a stand against mandates, to really say enough is enough. JP Sears was the compere, the MC, introducing the speeches. There was some, if you hadn't seen the footage yet, the speeches were incredibly inspiring, moving. There were really devastating stories about those who have been affected by adverse reactions. But the whole event was about freedom, choice, informed consent, justice, and solidarity, really with a strong message of humanity, truth, love, and change underpinning the overall event. It was really a really powerful event. So a really strong pushback. The event organizers themselves said the goal is to show a united front of bringing people together, vaccinated, unvaccinated, Democrats, Republicans, all together in solidarity. It was live streamed on Del Bigtree's platform, The High Wire. You can see the footage. Now, this comes off the back of further efforts in the legal system in the US. The High Court in the United States allowed Biden's administration to require vaccinations for healthcare workers. However, on Friday last week, a federal judge blocked Biden's administration of the COVID. Biden's administrations of the COVID-19 vaccine requirement for federal employees. So this has now been blocked. Earlier in the month, the Supreme Court blocked the administration's COVID-19 vaccine or testing rules for large private employers. So the legal system in places around the world is starting to make headway. We've seen 2 legal cases launched in the last week in the United Kingdom against vaccine mandates. So the public pressure, the legal pressure, and eventually, hopefully, the media pressure. Watch this space, at least the independent media. You've always got me. You've always got Mr. Rogan. We're in your corner, pushing back, and many others. Salute all of those independent media outlets who've got the courage and faith the courage and integrity to stand up against these things. But these are really, really important initiatives, and it's fantastic to see the results in America. Now, in South America, we don't often hear about South America, but in Bolivia, the government suspended its plans to implement vaccine passports. There was a strong movement where protesters actually created blockades, significant blockades in at least 3 of the 9 major Bolivian cities, which prevented travel and access to the city. And this form of direct action led the government to changing course on its vaccine mandates. So we're seeing all across the world. There's citizens uprising, legal interventions, businesses taking a stand through defying government mandates. We're seeing public sector employees. We're seeing the police, firefighters, teachers, every creating color, every background taking a stand across the world. As I mentioned, 150 cities last weekend. Now, there's a couple of places I want to mention that we shouldn't miss out, which is really important in terms of understanding the global picture. One of the key elements of this whole story over the last couple of years has been around the vaccine rollout in Israel. So let's take a look at what's been happening in Israel, because as you probably know, Israel has been leading. It was the first to lead out the vaccine rollout, but it's also the first to lead the fourth shot to its elderly population. And despite high numbers of triple vaccinated citizens, and now this fourth shot, they're witnessing some of the highest case numbers so far. However, the hospital studying the efficacy of the fourth shot last week stated that the preliminary research indicates that a fourth dose of the vaccine provides very limited, only a limited defense against the Omicron variant. So we have to ask the question, without diversifying into the science here, what is the point of these booster shots at that scale? And many of these mandates, of course, are predicated on this campaign. So it's an important piece of the puzzle. But perhaps this news in Israel, why this is relevant, is that it may have spurred some strong opposition against the vaccine mandates at senior levels. And in an extraordinary turn, Israel's finance minister called an end to the country's Green Pass system last week. Now, this is from last week. He wrote on Twitter, "There is no medical and epidemiological logic in the Green Pass, and many other experts are in agreement." And he said, what there is a direct damage to the economy as a result of the mandates, daily functioning, daily citizens' lives, and in addition, significant contribution to the panic amongst the public. So the finance minister said working with all parties to eliminate the Green Pass and maintain a normal routine for the citizens of Israel. So even where we've seen this high level of intensity around the vaccines and the mandates, it's fantastic to see senior officials in Israel pushing back. Now, similarly, Israel's vaccine chief was seen on the Unheard show recently, interviewed, talking about the vaccine passports, and supported an end to the vaccine passports by adding that the Green Pass concept is no longer relevant in the Omicron era and should be phased out. He added that he and his colleagues were surprised and disappointed that the vaccines hadn't stopped transmission. So invalidating the need for these vaccine mandates and passports. He said that the biggest mistake of the pandemic in Israel was closing the schools and education. Hopefully over time we'll start to see this as a big piece of the puzzle. He went as far as apologizing for that. This is a time of real change, I will add. Many of the things that people have supported in the past are now falling apart in terms of their evidence base. From our point of view, I say from our point of view, for those of us who have been critical or skeptics, as we've been labeled, that's a kind word that we've been used, other than conspiracy theorists and spreaders of misinformation. Of course, yesterday's misinformation is today's truth, but we know that. So we've seen this widespread pushback. We're starting to see the narrative crumble. And when we see things like this happening in Israel, could we be witnessing an end to mandates in a country that was one of the pioneers in introducing the COVID vaccine and the vaccine passport? So things are changing fast around the world. And last but not least on this overall message, last week, the World Health Organization's director for Europe stated that the Omicron variant has moved the COVID pandemic into a new phase and could bring an end to measures in Europe, and said it's plausible that the region is moving towards a kind of pandemic endgame. I mean, we could dispute what that endgame is, but we are obviously seeing a changing tune in many parts of the press. So let's take stock of these events, take courage from what we're seeing from different countries and nations. It's important that we remain strong, stand our ground, hold the line. There is no need to return to any form of restrictions. And it's time to have one big push to kick back the vaccine mandates and to kick the vaccine passports into touch and begin to start to unpick the very real issues that we've witnessed over the last 2 years when it comes to the stories and the narrative that we've seen over the last 2 years, which is really beginning to unfold in a significant way. And the next phase, I think, beyond this kicking of these mandates and the passports into touch is really, really, really important to recognize that we trawl through that evidence in the last 2 years and seek about creating justice and accountability. Someone said, why am I laughing at the idea of an end game? I'm laughing at the idea of an end game because they are saying that this part of the puzzle means that we're moving out of this phase. But we know that there are so many things that have entered into the trajectory of what we've witnessed in COVID-19. We've seen things like obviously the digital surveillance technology increasing throughout the last couple of years. There's all kinds of developments that have yet to even unfold. So that's why I kind of laughed at the idea that we're into this endgame phase, because unfortunately the pandemic and COVID in itself is, it's created a new wave of technocratic and a whole series of interventions that could curb the civil liberties and rights of people. So it's extremely important that we recognize, firstly, that we, with focus, can end the vaccine mass passports, end the vaccine mandates. I truly believe in the United Kingdom with one big push, with this 10 days to flatten the NHS mandates, with all the things that are happening, from protests to lobbying the unions to the legal cases. We saw today, if you haven't seen it, from the Together Declaration, we've seen the launch of the new legal case by Stephen Jackson and co. There is all kinds of pushbacks across all fronts on these key pieces. But then it's really about really disseminating what's happened and deconstructing what's happened and seeking justice, because the reality is there has been many, many wrongdoings over the past 2 years. And much of this has barely even scratched the surface when it comes to what the media has shown. We've been covering it extensively on the Pandemic podcast. We've done over 500 episodes now on the issues. But it's really important now we formalize the evidence base and start to really create change. And for me, there's two sides to this. We double down on the resistance on the global level to kick these things into touch. But then we also double down on the piece around ensuring this never happens again. But that even more importantly, we start to reimagine the world in front of us, because people are talking still about going back to getting their freedoms back. I understand the sentiment. We all want to have liberty and freedom and human rights, but we got to stop talking about going backwards, because to me, the old normal wasn't too shiny. This is an opportunity for us to really make some really significant changes, some real broad stroke transformation in the world, in order to make the world a much more vibrant and exciting place to live, given all of the fear and drama that we've been through over the last 2 years. And that's not to take away from the seriousness of the situation. Many people have suffered with their health, but many people have suffered as full inquiry and evaluation and justice that I think will need to follow for the misconduct and various other flaws that we've seen delivered in the last 2 years. But that's not all. Really, it's now the time to start to look forward. It's time to look forward and think about how we change things. And for those, I say that yesterday's misinformation is today's truth, and that's really the case. We've seen things dismissed as conspiracy in 2021 that became true in 2020. In 2020 that became true in 2021. We've seen things that are called misinformation and fact checked, and all of a sudden, 6 months later, it's the headline story of the day. The reality is there are many things that were dismissed as conspiracy, anti-vax, or misinformation yesterday, metaphorically, that are true today, that were true then. So it's really important for those people who have, there are people out there who have, I've been attacked repeatedly, of course, put myself on the parapet to speak out about these things. I've repeatedly been attacked. I've been called all kinds of names. But I've stood strong. I've got thick skin, and I keep going, and I will keep going, because this is about finding the truth. This is about integrity. This is about doing the right thing for humanity. And many of us have had scathing attacks. Even the light end of things, being called anti-vaxxers or conspiracy theorists, spreaders of misinformation. But we're not here to say. My view is we're not here to say, I told you so, as the evidence emerges. That's not my approach, certainly. My approach here is as people start to see the truth unfold, which they will because it's coming. It's coming at scale. You just need to follow the various news stories and pieces of evidence that are starting to emerge in the mainstream press as well as the alternative media. You're seeing it everywhere. You're seeing it everywhere. The scientists, the big medical journals are starting to scratch their heads thinking, what just happened? The evidence is popping up everywhere, showing all of the flaws in the process. And there'll be no excuse to say we were just in a crisis. We didn't have time to think about it, because there are many of us from the very get-go who have been critiquing and saying, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right, this doesn't make sense. Yet the things have moved forward. So you cannot say that there weren't people raising the alarm from the very beginning. But I will not be one of the people that says, I told you so. I'll be one of the people that extends my hand and says, it's okay. What you called me yesterday doesn't affect me. My arm is extended to you to join me join us all on the pursuit of truth and justice, because there is no point with our ego saying, I told you so. But there is a point in saying, I raise my hand, I extend my hand to you and say, join us and help us in solidarity to tackle these issues and find justice. This is the important point for us now. I do believe in 2022, this is our unique opportunity. I talked about it in my end of year video. There's two things that are most important for 2022, healing and meaning. We have to heal the relationships amongst us that have broken down as a result of the fractures that have occurred as a result of the intensity of the divide and conquer nature of the media. And we join together to pursue the truth, to pursue to find the integrity once again in science, and to find the answers that can help us understand what happened and how we make sure it never happens again. But more importantly, how we can look forward and we can start to challenge and transform the very basis of the problems that we've witnessed. Everything from media to politics to science to humanity itself. We have to look ourselves in the mirror and understand, what is it within human beings that enables us to behave in this way that we've seen over the last 2 years, and why we've not been able to have open debate and challenge when it mattered most, so that we could have minimized the harms that we've witnessed across the world. Now is the time for us to recognize that. But at the moment, we're seeing the resistance rising. I've started this broadcast with the trucks heading towards Canada. They're heading there for their big protest there tomorrow. I've talked about some of the key resistance across the world in tonight's broadcast on the back of over 150 cities rising up last year. Many people aren't even aware that there is this resistance, but the resistance is rising across the world. And I do believe over the months to come, we will see a united approach in the United Kingdom. We'll see a united approach around the world as we begin to kick the vaccine mandates and the vaccine passports into touch. And we begin to ask those really important questions about what just happened and what can we do about it in order to create change. Because ultimately, this is about seeking accountability and making sure this doesn't happen again. So on that note, I wish you well. Thank you so much for tuning in on this Friday night broadcast. Hopefully it's a message of positivity, showing the impact of the resistance around the world. As I mentioned, we have been censored on Facebook, which is one of our primary distribution channels. We have a large audience on Facebook. I encourage you, please, to help us by sharing this broadcast. Share this broadcast, take the link, put it on Twitter, put it on Telegram, share it on Facebook, help us to distribute this message, help people to recognize that this resistance is rising around the world. We've also posted this in our brand new private online community, the Elevate Network. We've got a small number, I say hand, there's more than a handful of people. We've got a small number of people testing the platform for us, a couple hundred people testing the Elevate Network online platform, which is going live next week. We're opening the doors to the public next week. We're very excited to invite our email subscribers and the public, those who watch the show. So if you're not already on our mailing list, go to danjgregory.com/pandemic, enter your name and email, very secure server. We will be sending you the details of that, of our launch on Monday, where we're opening up the doors to our private platform, where already there's some phenomenal conversation happening about how we can challenge what's going on, and more importantly, how we can transform ourselves and transform the world around us in order that we begin to really affect change at the grassroots level, which I believe is where the real opportunity is for us to create lasting change beyond what we've seen here. We really are at the dawn of a transformative era. This next decade, the remainder of this decade, I believe, will be look back in history as one of the most transformative decades in hundreds of years. And it's down to us to help us to become a catalyst for that wave of change, that counterculture movement that is going to push back and challenge so much of what is wrong, not only in terms of the pandemic response, but actually the more deeper issues facing humanity and the world we live in. So if you want to be part of that conversation, you want to be part of that change, we invite you to the Elevate Network. We're opening up the door on Monday. Join our mailing list to be one of the first to hear about it. Head over to danjgregory.com.